right, you not get that message? Just...
Sheriff's office!
It is a scenario played out routinely in Colorado. A mentally ill person seems out of control and may seem threatening.
Matt, come out!
Police are called.
Matt, come out of the room now!
The person may be agitated, combative, and in some cases, even psychotic.
Matt, open the door!
But last New Year's Eve at an apartment complex in Douglas County,
Open the door!
the worst happened. A mentally ill man spiraling out of control with a gun.
Sheriff's office!
One officer is killed, others are wounded, and the man, Matthew Reihl, with a long history of mental illness and known to law enforcement, also died.
I mean, this was the worst outcome.
The gunman's mother, who had tried in vain for months to get her son help, had hoped it wouldn't come to this.
That he had died and that he had also killed somebody else.
It has happened over and over again in Colorado, at an Aurora theater where James Holmes murdered 12 and injured dozens of others, at a Planned Parenthood clinic where Robert Louis Deere killed 3 people, including a police officer, on a Colorado Springs street where Noah Harpham, who had been in and out of treatment for years, walked down the street with 2 guns, randomly killing 3 people before he was killed by police. In Colorado and across the country, there is often a pattern of escalating behavior that does not cross the line to danger until it does.
There was just no way to get him help.
You couldn't force him.
We couldn't force him.
That's right. Colorado law says if one is not in imminent danger, meaning right now, then involuntary treatment of a mentally ill person is not allowed. But should imminent be removed from the statute?
If we were to adjust our statute, we would have been able to intervene much earlier and most likely would have been able to eliminate the situation on New Year's Eve from occurring.
Good evening. I'm John Ferrugia. Welcome to Insight. The recent mass murders at a Florida high school covered by media across the country again brought the nation's attention to concerns about mentally ill persons who have access to guns. The gunmen in Florida have been identified with emotional and mental issues, but laws in most states, including Colorado, do not allow involuntary treatment of persons who are mentally ill or seriously depressed who have guns. Some families, including those whose mentally ill adult children have committed murder, say Colorado's imminent danger standard is simply too high, preventing needed intervention. We begin with an exclusive interview with the mother of Matthew Reihl, the mentally ill gunman who murdered a Douglas County Sheriff's deputy on New Year's Eve in 2017. Both she and the Sheriff of Douglas County agree the deadly confrontation should have never happened.
He did very well in school. He graduated from CU Denver, magna cum laude.
There is no question Matthew Reihl was a good student. After graduating CU, he moved to Wyoming, where he loved to hunt and fish, and he enrolled in law school. His future was bright. He had friends, and he had a sense of duty, joining the National Guard as a medic and eventually deploying to Iraq before finishing law school.
Even after he came home, he always kept his medic bag in his car in case he needed to help anybody.
But his mother says Iraq changed him. His medical records show he exhibited PTSD and anxiety related to his service.
I don't think he was mentally ill until after he came back.
In 2014, after he finished law school and was working in a private firm, Matthew Reihl had his first mental break.
I was visiting my younger son in Southern California, and we both started getting text messages from Matthew that made no sense.
She rushed to Wyoming, where she found him clearly disturbed.
All the windows inside were covered with like silver plastic material, and there were giant tubs of water all over the house.
So she decided to take him to the VA hospital in Sheridan, Wyoming for mental health treatment. And she removed several guns from his house for safekeeping. What were you concerned about?
Just that he could harm himself or others, or, that it probably wasn't a good idea for somebody who was mentally ill to have guns.
Reihl didn't stay at the VA hospital long. He first walked away and then later simply checked himself out, and his mother had to return his guns. As his mental health declined, so did his law practice. He eventually returned to Colorado to live in the basement of his parents' home. Records provided by the family show that he was receiving mental health treatment and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. He was not found to have either suicidal or homicidal tendencies, but he was on antipsychotic medication. Then, in early 2017, his mother says he stopped taking his meds.
He became more reclusive. He stopped eating meals with the family and just wanted to be left alone. He had started an accidental fire in the microwave, and he was just seemed very disconnected.
The family was concerned and a little scared, so they reached out to the Lone Tree Police Department.
We were hoping that they could offer us some assistance to get him help. They went to the house and tried to talk to him, and that was what precipitated him moving out. For a long time, we didn't know where he was.
But Matthew Reihl knew where they were and began sending a string of bizarre emails that turned cruel and harassing, often prompting strange phone calls at night.
I think he was advertising that I was a hooker and posting my cell phone number on the internet.
This one falsely claims his mother was a transsexual prostitute who takes appointments at her home.
You know, it was a crazy person picking on us.
Afraid?
Afraid, concerned, but unable to do anything because we had no ability to do anything to help him.
At the same time he was harassing his family, Matthew also began sending bizarre and apparently threatening messages to his former law school professors at the University of Wyoming. And he obsessively posted dozens of angry comments on his social media page.
They were afraid that he would harm somebody up there, and so they were all on the lookout for him.
And with good reason. A university dean asked campus police to patrol the law school because Matthew Reihl references the shooting today in Texas and referred to shooting someone dead on the streets of Laramie.
Scumbag, dirtbag, liar. He's the boss, huh?
Meanwhile, Matthew was also posting video on YouTube, harassing the Lone Tree Police Department and an officer who had pulled him over for speeding.
This cop needs to get fired.
He then began harassing Lone Tree city officials, and that brought in the Douglas County Sheriff.
Through a process of conducting the investigation, we had our community response team, which is a mental health response team, attempt to engage him.
Tony Spurlock is the Douglas County Sheriff. It was his deputy who was killed in the shooting. Other deputies were wounded.
We had a number of contacts and interviews with him through the doors or via phone.
Despite Matthew's erratic behavior and veiled threats, the Douglas County District Attorney told the Sheriff's Department in an email, "We have to balance the suspect's First Amendment rights with the Lone Tree Police Sergeant's rights. We do not believe the charges are appropriate at this time." So police took precautions.
I know that the Lone Tree Police had sent out a bulletin to all law enforcement around Colorado.
That information, available on in-car computers, could be seen by the deputies who responded to the call at Matthew Reill's apartment.
This is why we flagged it. You know, use caution, mental health, threat to government, threat to law enforcement officers.
911, what is the address of the emergency?
And that is why around 3 a.m. on New Year's Eve, 4 Douglas County deputies, instead of just one, responded to the 911 call.
Yes, I do have some weapons. I own firearms.
Reihl was streaming his call live via his Periscope app.
Do you have probable cause?
I've already told you that we identified.
What's your probable cause?
Once outside, Matthew was cocky and loud, but not out of control, as he claimed his roommate assaulted him.
And I was really freaking scared.
Deputies finally calmed him down.
What's your first name again?
Matthew.
Matthew. Zach, good to meet you.
Shortly afterward, they left.
All right, Matt, unless there's anything else you need to tell me tonight, we're clearing out of here.
Just after 5 a.m., Matthew Reihl again called police, and they returned.
Hey, Matt.
Who's there? Who's there? Identify yourself.
It's Deputy Parrish, Douglas County Sheriff's Office.
May I ask who's there?
His demeanor was much different.
Can you help me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, let's do that.
I just feel like you're really upset. I'm not.
Well, I am.
Matthew continued to live stream the incident.
You not get that message?
Just
He was displaying aggressive behavior, aggressive language. He had been throwing things.
They weren't even there to help.
Completely different than the 2 hours previous.
Civil division now.
He was clearly, at that point,
Out there stalking.
a danger to himself
Right.
and to others based upon all the totality of those circumstances that were there. Imminent danger, right then.
And Deputy Zachary Parrish knew it. The threshold had been met for a mental health hold.
We're gonna take him. Put an M1.
But Matthew wouldn't come out. So a half hour later, entering the apartment with keys from Matthew's roommate, who was the leaseholder, they prepared to forcibly enter Rehl's bedroom.
They had a plan. They knew, hey, this is who's going to go in.
Is that his room right there? Yep.
We have to breach this door now because he has put stuff up against it.
And the sheriff says once it was determined he had guns and that he was a threat to himself and surrounding apartments.
You have to go in there and disrupt the situation to really protect that danger to others. I can't leave him in there.
The deputies brought shields designed to deflect a bullet and attempted to enter the bedroom where Matthew Reihl was holed up and raging.
Open the door! Sheriff's office!
In the barrage of fire, Deputy Zach Parrish died, and 3 other deputies were wounded.
They were not prepared for him to have as much weapon power behind that in that room that he had. The shield that they brought in does not protect us from high caliber rifles.
Went right through it.
Went through it like butter.
Later, a SWAT team went in. Matthew Reihl died in an exchange of gunfire. And yet another officer was wounded. 2 uninvolved residents of the complex were also wounded by Reihl. Even though they know he presented a danger that night, the family still has questions.
Nobody needed to die that night. He was cornered in his bedroom, in his apartment. They knew he had guns. What was the rush?
We still have to go through that door to go get this individual because he is now endangering everybody else, all the other people that I'm charged to protect.
I think that they could have called the family. We would have willingly come to talk to him, to try to get him to come out and try to get treatment.
You can talk to negotiators, you can talk to clinicians. I don't know the relationship between him and his mother. And he may be the reason why he is acting out right now is because he just got off the phone with his mother. And now I'm going to bring her into this mix.
But one thing both Tony Spurlock and Susan Reihl agree on is that the incident could have been prevented long before New Year's Eve.
That night should never have happened.
If we have the ability to intervene earlier, it is so much safer for everyone.
He was mentally ill. A family should be able to get additional help for that person.
To force some type...
Force some sort of intervention that instead of waiting for that critical harming themselves or others. I mean, that's a ridiculous criteria.
The Reihl family, many in law enforcement, the state public defender, and some prosecutors say the imminent danger standard is simply too high a bar.
Well, I think that if we were to adjust our statute, we would have been able to intervene much earlier and most likely would have been able to eliminate the situation on New Year's Eve from occurring.
Why don't we have civil or criminal remedies to at least do safekeeping for a period of time on these firearms so we know we have people in crisis?
Boulder County Sheriff Joe Pelly's son, Jeff Pelly, is a Douglas County deputy.
Where you at? In the chest. Okay.
He was shot and almost killed in the New Year's Eve incident and is now recovering. For years, Sheriff Pelly has dealt with issues of the mentally ill in jails as part of a task force on the governor's Colorado Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice.
The man that shot my son was obviously mentally ill.
Identify yourself.
He had a small arsenal of weapons. And we are in a place as the police and as a community where we can't do anything else about it until he snaps, until something bad happens. That's not good public policy, right?
Public policy in the form of laws in other states that allow a family of a mentally ill person or law enforcement to petition a judge to force involuntary treatment and store any weapons for safekeeping. It's called a red flag law. The laws are now in place in 6 states. Florida is the most recent after the Parkland killings. 22 other states and the District of Columbia are considering such statutes.
If there are sufficient warning signs, we can now get a gun violence restraining order. We don't have to wait for another crime to occur.
Mara Elliott is city attorney of San Diego. There have been 19 successful petitions in her city for involuntary treatment of mentally ill persons who were deemed to show a pattern of threat or concern who had access to guns.
It's a measure to keep that person safe and people around that person safe and allow them the opportunity to get help.
And she says there are safeguards built in to protect the rights of the mentally ill, including a hearing within 21 days of the petition to the court. Neither police, the city attorney, nor the family make the final decision.
We need to prove to the satisfaction of a judge that there is a legitimate concern here that somebody is going to be a threat to themselves or to someone else. We're worried about lives here. So we have that burden of proof. On the flip side of it, the gun owner also has an opportunity to come to the court and tell their side of the story, to put their conduct into context.
We need that red flag law.
You need a lower statutory threshold.
We need a change in the statute to save lives.
Our research shows that this is an issue that affects tens of thousands of Coloradans that we know about. In 2017, statewide, 34,682 persons were deemed a threat to themselves or others. That's right, more than 34,000 people were placed on mental health holds in Colorado. And look at the numbers over the past 10 years. Over the decade, there has been an increase of 300%.
That's incredible.
For Governor John Hickenlooper, that is one more reason to support a red flag law in Colorado.
3/4 of our gun deaths in Colorado are suicides. Right? So the families right now oftentimes don't have any resource by which to separate their child or their loved one from the firearms by which they would either cause harm to themselves or others. In a state like Colorado, where we have a higher percentage of our people own guns, we should have a greater sense of urgency.
I oppose removing the word imminent.
Republican State Senator Kevin Lundberg voted against a red flag law in 2014 that would have removed the imminent danger standard for involuntary care. It failed because of concerns by both Republicans and Democrats about the rights of the mentally ill.
How about if we add some additional guardrails, some specificity, where if somebody maybe hits 4 or 5 markers of real problems, that could supersede the imminent term. But to simply remove it, it just opens it up too broadly.
But addressing the nexus of mental illness and guns goes much further than red flag laws. For the past 6 years, Bob and Arlene Holmes have been trying to learn and understand everything they can about violence and mental illness and how to address it. They come to this eclectic garden dedicated to crime victims in Southern California near their home, where they remember and pray for those who their son, James Holmes, murdered and maimed.
I think it's sort of what we are now. We're parents of a mass murderer, and it was a very bad crime, and he hurt a lot of people.
We search for answers still night and day. We've had people say to us, we thought these mass murderers must come from abused homes, but we know you and you never abuse. We don't fit people's picture of what the parents of a mass murderer is. And so people are, I hope, getting more educated on serious, severe mental illness, and that needs to be more done about detection at an early age.
Both say, as parents, they simply did not see or interpret clear warning signs when he was in high school and early in college that James Holmes was receding into mental illness.
Schizophrenia is like a robber. You start to notice that he's pulling back, staying alone much more, not talking very much. So when he was diagnosed later with schizophrenia or some of the other diagnoses along the schizophrenia spectrum, we learned that this gradual decline in interaction and in talking, speech, were hallmarks of this disease, this mental illness. People say to me, well, the things you're describing are teenagerhood. I can only sum it up in a sentence and say, it doesn't go away, it doesn't get better. And it did not go away for our son.
I'm very introverted. I'm not a particularly good communicator. And so when he showed that particular behavior, I wasn't really surprised or particularly alarmed.
So they say when a psychiatrist at CU, where he was studying, called them about a month before the shooting to tell them she was treating James, they thought it was a positive step.
I was reassured he's seeing somebody for social anxiety, and he's going to keep seeing her, and this is a good thing.
But Arlene was horrified when she later found out the psychiatrist never told them that James Holmes was having homicidal thoughts and talking about killing a lot of people. He was an adult, entitled by law to his privacy.
Do you think if you were given that information, do you think this would have happened?
We could fly back there and ensure that he was hospitalized. You're asking such a hypothetical. Who can say 100% that us could have prevented it? But we sure as hell would have tried.
And you think fear of HIPAA may have prevented that?
Yes. She didn't tell us what we needed to know.
HIPAA is the federal law that safeguards medical information. It was updated in 2016 to allow what is called compassionate communication, so that families can be notified of information that might help care for their loved one. Even so, Arlene Holmes says one of her goals is to help educate doctors who are afraid of being sued.
I think providers have to be specifically educated in when they're not tromping on HIPAA and tromping on civil rights, and when they are revealing information for the good of the patient so that they don't live in fear of litigation. It's crucial information. If your son wants to shoot people, kill people.
The Holmes are also trying to support more early identification of mental issues by school teachers, counselors, and administrators.
They may see things that the parents do not, because that is when a kid is around a lot of other people.
One of Arlene's missions, I think, is to sort of increase awareness among teachers that they may see things, and they might be sort of a first line of defense to sort of highlight that, oh, we think something may be going on here.
Do you blame yourselves for not knowing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're his parents.
We should have known if anybody would, so no, we didn't.
Yeah, we do.
Their son's in prison for the rest of his life, and and we still have to live our lives, and so do they. And so, part of me feels for them being put in that position, that spotlight, because of something that your son did.
Marcus Weaver was shot and seriously wounded by James Holmes, and Weaver's friend, Rebecca Wingo, was murdered. He is now an activist for preventing gun violence and says more has to be done to keep weapons from the mentally unstable.
Having a red flag law in Colorado would definitely thwart a lot of these mass shootings, and also thwart people who have guns who necessarily shouldn't have them.
Do you blame the Holmes for what their son did?
You can't blame the Holmes for what the son did.
Weaver says he has forgiven the shooter, although he does not know if all Aurora Theater victims feel the same way.
You can't know everything about your kids, and they weren't living in the same state. They did checks, and they did everything they possibly could from a distance. So you can't really blame them.
It's our fault for not being educated. If you're going to have a baby, you need to understand mental health, and you need to start looking for things and making sure that your kid has no mental health issues.
And that's the message.
That's the message.
And that is their reality, that victims live every day with what their son did.
They've lost a leg, they've lost a loved one.
They're paraplegic,
They're in a wheelchair for life.
We printed out a list, and periodically we pray for them. We go through it just to remember who they were and what happened to them.
You carry that with you?
Every day.
Mm-hmm.
Every day.
Mental illness, it just seems like it's just a big puzzle that I don't think we as a country have addressed.
Like many parents whose mentally ill adult children have committed murder, Susan Reihl feels guilt, but mostly helplessness.
He knew the law, and he never did anything to cross the line that would make it possible for us to get him help.
I don't blame the family. I mean, the family cooperated with us, and I think that they reached out to both Wyoming and to Lone Tree and to Douglas County and said, hey, these are the things that we know about our son, and their hands were tied as well.
In some sense, it was relief that at least this chapter was over.
As you're saying that, I can see that's a very hard thing for you to come to grips with, that you're actually relieved that your son died.
Well, my family thinks that I'm really horrible when I say that, but I'm not worried about him anymore. I know where he is, and I know that he's safe. He's finally safe. Even if he's dead, he's not suffering anymore. I mean, he wasn't the Matthew we knew after a certain point in time.
Do you believe if you had a red flag law prior to this incident that both your deputy and Matthew Reihl might be alive today?
I do, because I think if we had it, we would have taken him into custody when he was threatening the Lone Tree Police Sergeant. And if we didn't have it, we could have intervened then we could have done a lot of different things that we weren't allowed to do based upon the law.
This is an issue that crosses both ideological and party lines. Both the National Rifle Association and the ACLU oppose red flag laws, but for very different reasons. There's been an effort in the Colorado legislature to produce such a statute, but thus far, there's been no Republican sponsor. So the question is, will it take yet another shooting like the New Year's Eve murder of a Douglas County deputy before there is further serious discussion of a red flag law in our state? That's our Insight for tonight. I'm John Ferrugia. Thanks for joining us. Good night.